Hi there, my name's Adam Barker. I'm a human geographer at the University of Sheffield, and I'm also a settler Canadian from the overlapping territories of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe people in what's currently called Southern Ontario, Canada. My connection to commons comes through my engagement with Indigenous peoples and the very different ways of living on the land, sharing property, understanding sovereignty and territory that are expressed and enacted by Indigenous nations, and how much is lost under the homogenization of colonization that divides those lands up into individual private properties within a state. As part of my desire to work with Indigenous communities to gain the restitution of land bases, one of the primary things that I have to grapple with, along with lots of other activists and academics involved in this work, is how we change our relationships, not just towards Indigenous people, but towards each other and to the lands that we all rely on in order to sustain ourselves and to sustain our societies. And one of the things that we keep coming back to is that colonization is extractive. It depletes the lands and therefore the more than human communities that Indigenous nations rely on for their integrity, for their traditions, for their own ability to replicate themselves. And therefore, we cannot be extractive and also say that we are being decolonizing or that we are trying to work with Indigenous nations. So, in order to be non-extractive, one of the things that I'm very interested in exploring is how settler people can exist in commons with each other in a way that sustains a commonwealth, and a commonwealth that tracks back to the land and that is fundamentally a commonwealth within an Indigenous territory and Indigenous sovereignty. And I look at everything about treaty relationships. I look at traditional alliances between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, and I try to consider what might be a future, what might that look like, wherein we are able to exist in a common relationship with the land, even though we don't necessarily recognize it, say the Haudenosaunee Confederacy where I am from, and settler people. We're never going to be the same, but what does it look like when we live on the land in common together? And we have historical treaties that tell us a little bit about that. So for example, the Turo Wampum Treaty, or Turo Gaswenta, that has existed for a long time, that informs a lot about my thinking and a lot about the thinking of a lot of other people about how we should relate in commons. And that treaty describes a Haudenosaunee canoe and a European ship traveling in parallel down the river of life together forever. And there's a whole unpacking around that common sharing of the river of life that I would really like to get into further, that I think holds a lot of value for those of us who want to pursue projects of commoning and of sharing in commons together.
So, hi, my name is Emma, or Dr. Battelle Lowman if you're feeling fancy. I am currently an academic at the University of Leicester in the UK, but not for long due to the upheavals in higher education in this country. And strangely, it's the upheavals in higher education in the UK that brought me into contact with commons and commoning and a really rich group of individuals and a sort of burgeoning collectives that are grappling with commoning as history, present, and future. So I came to commoning through a connection made on the picket line during a period of extreme righteous anger and an effort to build together with folks to resist the neoliberal demolishment of higher education as a social good in this country. And that brought me into contact through rich relationships into this wider sort of network and discourse of commoning. And the more that I started to get involved with that practice, discussion, and sort of resurgence in the United Kingdom, the more I found alignments from other parts of my life. And when you stop to think about it, you might realize commons are literally everywhere. My mum, who will always be cooler than me, was an anarcho-feminist in her day and worked with a number of collective organizations to preserve history and heritage and services for kids in the communities that I lived in. The work that I do involves the history and the present of settler colonization in what is called Turtle Island, or say the northern part of North America. And my experience is learning and failing in Indigenous contexts in those places has really, really helped to cement my ideas of what a better future looks like for colonized and colonizer, and that it is possible. And commons, I think, is a potential alignment between these different strands of work that are seeking to challenge and dismantle systems of harm and marginalization in the present and work towards dynamic, rich futures that embrace lifeways and the continuance of life instead of the continuance of capital.
So my name is Natasha Maru. I am a PhD researcher at IDS, and I research with nomadic pastoralists in Western India. I think I'm interested in the commons in two ways. One obviously is an academic interest because pastoralists are known to graze their animals in common pastures or common grasslands or shared resources, which of course then brings a lot of insights into how pastoralists negotiate access and engage in processes of commoning with other actors and users of resources such as agriculturalists and farmers and migrant workers. And this I find really interesting and see pastoral mobility as a commoning practice. But also I think in my personal life and viewpoints, I find commoning as a very interesting concept and practice to sort of build the kind of world in which we share and celebrate our shared humanity and connection with the world.
My name is Anna Zhu. I'm an assistant professor in environmental policy at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And I initially started my research in Madagascar looking at logging and extractive labor in Madagascar, and also actions to fight against the logging through protected areas. And in both cases we see kind of an enclosure of the commons, of common spaces, or a cordoning off of areas of land for protection to create carbon projects or national parks and so forth. And so that was kind of my first encounter with studying the commons or the loss of the commons in this very like green grabbing way that we talk about it now. And then more recently I've started a new project looking at Africa's Great Green Wall in the Sahel. And that project, that's a transcontinental project to engage with ecosystem restoration across the entire northern part of Africa, south of the Sahara, basically, from Senegal in the west to Ethiopia in the east. And looking at that project, it as a type of ecosystem restoration, but in this land that is mostly owned as commons or open access. And I did work in Senegal looking at the project there and the implementation, and we see in some ways recreation of this green grabbing type approach where it's cordoning off land to be reforested that people can't use, but also attempts to make it something more broader, not just cordoning off land, but really engaging people that use this space in a productive way. But it's very difficult because people are coming from all over the country, and it's sort of an extreme commons or a very open access situation where there's no clear community to manage the space, or if there's attempts to kind of create a community that might not necessarily be there among pastoralists that are highly nomadic in the country.
So my name is Marina Atka, and I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. And I'm part of a research team that focuses on participation, inclusion, and social change. And my work with the commons, it kind of takes me back to probably 15 or 20, embarrassing to say, years ago, when I first started working in Peru and then in Panama with indigenous communities. So with the Quechua in the Cusco area, and with the Panama in their territory called Cunayala, where I was really interested in the social and kind of cultural ways in which they build resilience and support kind of adaptive capacity in their using a biocultural kind of systems approach. And really I was engaging then with the commons in very much the kind of Ostrom tradition, right? And I was thinking about them as the kind of common pool resources that they were working with. And I guess through the years and where my work sits now, is more with the commoning, so bringing in the turning it into a verb and thinking about them much more as ongoing processes, as open-ended processes. And that, I think, links to some really interesting opportunities methodologically, which is where I spend a lot of my time, in thinking about conflict and care, right? And those two things as kind of two sides of a methodological coin. And so we see that in commoning in terms of the struggles that happen within, but also the way in which their responses to crisis or different forms of enclosure. But I think bringing a commoning lens into discussions around transdisciplinary and participatory methodologies in the kind of sustainability space, I think it brings a kind of sharp angle around conflict and the role that plays that I think could be really interesting.
My name's Ivana Rengo. I've been working for some 27 years with the Andrew Lees Trust, an NGO that serves communities in southern Madagascar. And originally my work took me there to develop social and environmental projects with communities, focusing on food security, particularly around communications as well, and non-formal learning using radio, interactive techniques. But during the course of my time and involvement in Madagascar, the looming presence of a mining, very large extractives project finally came to pass and moved into the region, displacing people and displacing them not just from their ancestral lands but also from their ancestral livelihoods. And with that came quite a lot of tension around people's not just loss of their identity and their own value systems, but also losses in terms of real value of what those lives provided for them.
Yes. So my name is Janis Rigou. I am from Greece, and I just finished my co-tutorial PhD at Macquarie University in Australia and at University of Copenhagen in Denmark. My first encounter with commons and commoning came when I realized that commons can play a vital role in reconfiguring politics in the Anthropocene, the new geological epoch that we think of as the epoch that the humans are akin to a geological force. I see commoning as a concept and as a potential mode of politics that is based on practices of collective care. I see a radical potential for transforming our views of the world, the relation that we have with other humans and non-humans, but also I also see limitations and problematize the way that we sometimes tend to give so much potential to commons and commoning before realizing the strategies and the ways that commons and commoning relates to state authorities or the markets.
I'm Brian Klein. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan in the departments of Afro-American and African Studies and the program in the environment. And I, in my work as a political ecologist working in Madagascar, have especially been interested in the creation of commons in a couple of spaces that they are not often observed or haven't been documented, particularly in goldfields and in mines. So often in the way that we often think of commons, we picture renewable resources like forests and fields and waterways. But in the context where I'm working in northern Madagascar, I have seen a case and context in which the goldfields over time have been produced as a sort of commons. And this, of course, is partially due to kind of geological characteristics of gold deposits and how they're engaged with and understood. but also due to kind of complex histories of resistance to expropriation by small-scale gold miners, the emergence of an understanding of gold as kind of the economic lifeblood of the region, and a commitment to maintaining collective access. And so kind of consistent resistance to attempts to enclose the goldfields, and to kind of maintain this as a community resource, a sort of mineral commons.